sometimes, certainly if it's underrepresented. So, yeah.
I like that you teased that about a little thing about objectivity, because we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But to start, we're going to talk a little bit about tropes. And so we often see a lot of tropes when reporting on lower income communities, right? Or whether it's individuals. So things like, the victim, right? Sort of the victim of circumstance, if you will. And reporters will often have to go to these communities and try to, get the tragic backstory. Then you have the criminal, the person who, people reading this should really be concerned about. And then you have, who I'm almost most concerned with, the extraordinary person. That person who walks 10 miles to work every single day so that their boss bought them a new car, right? The really feel-good story, and really reinforcing the idea that if only you were extraordinary enough, that society should help you then as well. So in your work, how have you guys sort of fought against using these tropes and these misconceptions about poverty? Alex, we can begin with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just so fundamentally don't think that way that I avoid those kind of tropes. When we're writing about certainly like labor or workplace issues, it's a collective of people who are dealing with these issues, and they all seem to deal with them regardless of how individually talented or hardworking or anything else. There's only so much a very talented person can do, right? So I think writing about, one way I do this is to both talk about groups and collectives and what those things can accomplish. But I think also, as far as the poor, the best strategy for counteracting this is to talk to the poor and have them quoted in your pieces, because this both counteracts that idea, but also they often have very smart, remarkable things to say about their situation that you certainly couldn't know without speaking with them. So I think it's generally, I try not to write any piece about any group of people without talking to some of them and keeping that in the piece.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think, listening is key, because I think a lot of, the temptation is there to impose whatever narrative you think is going on in your head on the story. But for me, a journalist's job is to listen and capture the essence of what someone is telling you. And by doing that very simple task, I think your story will reflect the agency of the people in it. I think it's important to point, even if you're using one individual as an example, I do try and make an effort to connect it to bigger structural issues, which I think sometimes people feel that can be boring in a story, or it makes it less readable. But I think it's really important to carve out space to do that, because workers will get in touch with you and say, I had no idea that I wasn't the only one who is experiencing this. And that's particularly important in a precarious economy where, people don't have a workplace anymore. They're out there as an independent contractor or driving an Uber or whatever, and they're not seeing they're not able necessarily to connect the dots between their individual situation and the way that laws or loopholes are structuring their environment. I think, one example was our investigation into fear of foods and the use of temp agency workers. And obviously there's a whole system that allowed that story to happen. And yes, people were being exploited, but it was also really important for us in that story to show even the small ways that people resisted, the way that, the system was not lost on people. Like, yes, they needed to put food on the table, but they knew what was going on, and it's important to recognize that in the story, that people are not just victims of their environment. They may be impacted by it, but there are small and big ways that people resist.
And so I love that you guys both brought up, not focusing necessarily on the individual and trying to connect it to sort of bigger systemic issues. And so what do you guys sort of recommend to other journalists out there as, strategies that they can use that, because we always see these articles every, even just like those stats we mentioned at the beginning of this, X amount of Canadians, let's say three Canadians own as much wealth as the bottom 60% of the population. We see this kind of thing every day, actually, in the media, but they're never really tied to a why or a systemic sort of problem as to why these kinds of economic inequalities happen. So what advice would you give to young journalists out there about how they can talk about these larger problems without focusing so much on the individuals? Sorry.
I mean, I do think that having a human story makes people connect to a policy issue. So I don't want to, and like you said, people who are impacted by issues are often, or always, the most articulate voice in explaining it. But in terms of not being shy to connect it to bigger issues, I think for me the most helpful thing is to just really build those relationships and connections with folks in grassroots movements who can really explain to you in layman's terms, what's going on a bigger level, and then you can find a way to make that relatable and to make it digestible for other people. And yeah, I think readers are interested. I think we suffer when we sort of get carried away with this assumption that people don't want substantive news, and I think that they do.
Yeah, I mean, I second a lot of what Sara said. Certainly what we've seen in the US over the past couple of years is people really do want a systemic analysis of things, and without that, a lot of people feel very powerless, thinking that they're isolated and the only ones in poverty or the only ones struggling. And so I think one useful thing journalists can do is, exactly as you said earlier, like connect those dots and kind of use that in your writing. And so I think not being afraid to write about structure, or I often use history. I often kind of reference how this happened exactly like this 30 years ago, and here's what people said then. And so often, one good strategy if you feel sort of confined by your publication is quote other people who give that analysis. And I think as far as talking to sources, don't be afraid to go beyond asking them the who, what, when, where of whatever the story is. Ask them why, and you'd be, again, often very surprised by the structural analysis people are giving and how they're making sense of what they're experiencing. And then, again, this is the easy way out. Often I find I'm a leftist, I'll write in a mainstream publication, and what I wouldn't be able to say, well, if this person at the heart of the story is saying it, then it's, it fits. And so, give people the time to explain what they're experiencing.
So I love that you guys both talked about sort of building those relationships with your actual subjects, because I think sometimes, covering poverty and covering the poor, it can often be described as a little bit exploitative. Journalists often have this relationship with their subjects where it's more extractive than anything else. You go into these communities, you get your quotes, you get your images of, walls with cracks in them and whatever have you, and you leave without offering much in return. And again, I think, a lot of people would call that pretty exploitative. So what do you guys sort of do to try and counter that? What do you do to really build that trust with your subjects, and actually make them comfortable? Because we've seen even just this past summer in Toronto, I think a lot of people had a lot of problem with how, gun violence was being covered in Toronto. It was a really kind of hot button issue, to the point where a lot of the communities themselves were getting quite upset with how they were being portrayed. So what strategies would you guys employ to try and counter that and really build that trust from the ground up?
I think I would certainly say my relationships with, again, the sort of grassroots movement is important in terms of connecting with people. There are a ton of workers out there who are standing up for what they believe in, and they'll often gravitate towards these movements to get involved and make a difference. And if you already have a good relationship with people they trust, it's easier, and the people they trust you, it's easier to form a relationship. But I think, I totally understand as a journalist the pressure to deliver a story, especially as a young journalist. But I think that what's served me well is really to put the concerns and the priorities of the worker first. If a worker doesn't feel comfortable coming forward or changes their mind or has questions, that has to come first. And if at the end of the day it means I don't run that story, that's more important to me. And I mean, not that you need to think about it in a sort of mercenary way, but I would say that has served me better in the long term in terms of generating future stories than pouncing on that immediate story, even if you sense that the person is maybe a little uncomfortable or hesitant. I think just investing and respecting the folks that you're working with in the long term is the better strategy to actually do good journalism.
Yeah, I mean, I want to find something I disagree with you a lot on, maybe eventually. But yeah, I mean, I think of myself as of the movements that I cover. And so, though I'm not structurally accountable to them, and I do have, in potentially power over them. I could run a quote that ruins someone's life. I think the best way to avoid doing that is exactly what you're saying, of build the relationships where it's not that they're reading your drafts and vetoing everything, but if I'm surrounded by the very types of people that I'm going to write about, it helps to sort of go and sit down when you write the story and be aware of what might be a concern, what you might want to go back and ask them about, and ask if they're comfortable with a certain quote. Stuff like that, I think is just, it's structurally at odds with the economy of journalism, right? Where you're just supposed to, okay, you have a quote, put it in a story, run it. But to exactly your point, in the long term of writing, it doesn't take a lot of mistakes to really lose a community's trust, and it's just not worth it to do that. I do think it's widespread, but as a thing people do, and I think people are rightfully unhappy when that happens. It sounds like in Toronto that's happening in certain issues. But yeah, I mean, just I know this is impractical for certain journalists in certain fields, but being of the community as much as possible, so that it isn't extraction, it's really sort of being an amplifier for certain issues, and that's sort of, at least for me, if you're not amplifying people that you think should be heard more, then maybe you should, I don't know, I wouldn't write about a story that I didn't think more people should be aware of, sort of the protagonists of it, so.
So, in regards to the actual content that we create, so a quick Google search could tell you that, if you searched up the poor and you read those headlines, it'd show you that coverage of the lower income communities is not always intended to be read by those same communities. So we actually did that today, and we just, wanted to see what would come up today as of October 1st, 2018. And here's just a couple of them. Helping the poor is not easy. Right? To help poor, earned income tax credit better than minimum wage hike. Here's my favorite. Capitalism helps the poor, socialism doesn't. All right. So as you can see, we're not really reporting on these low-income communities for them. I think we're really reporting on these communities for the middle and upper classes to read about. And so some people might kind of lay the blame on, like, the profit model of news. It's subscription-based, online paywalls. What are your thoughts on how we can sort of better serve the information needs of these communities themselves? And sort of what are the concrete steps that media organizations themselves can take to ensure that there is better, more comprehensive coverage of these issues that are actually impacting poor communities for them?
It's a very big question. I am going to go to bat for the idea of paying for your news because I have a vested interest in that. But and as we all know, journalism is in a state of crisis, and we need a way to make it financially sustainable, or it just simply won't exist as we know it today. And yes, it needs improvement, but we need jobs. And to that point, we need newsrooms that are in a financial position to hire young reporters, reporters of color, reporters from working class communities. Our newsrooms are not diverse enough as it stands, and I think as a result, we get the headlines that you Googled. There is far too heavy of a tilt towards white, middle, and upper class journalists in our newsroom, and I think our coverage reflects that. In terms of, I think it does depend on the journalist. I know a lot of my colleagues individually would never think of themselves as writing for a middle class or upper class audience. And I know myself that I'm regularly contacted by lower income folks who have accessed our stories, whether it's through the library or wherever they're able to get their hands on a copy of the Star. But we've just erected a paywall, and I do fundamentally believe that journalism is a public service, and I think we do need to think about how we keep it accessible for folks who can't afford a subscription.
Yeah, I'm not going to touch the question of how do we actually fund journalism. I think there's just, it feels to me, at least in the U.S. context, it's just a given that the majority of your readership, almost regardless of where you're writing, is going to be middle and upper class. It's just, I don't know. Every time I write about labor, I know that there will be people who are affected by the issue who will find that story because someone will send it to them, or they will, I just wrote a story for the Washington Post about a big contract dispute happening among the UPS workers, and there's about 250,000 of them. And that was a good example of, I think of the Washington Post as I'm writing to generally I'm going to be read by the very people who oppose that union, who want to destroy it, who want to lower its standards. And that, obviously, I give some thought to what I am and am not going to include for that audience. But in that context, I was writing about something where there was a real fight and a story in a mainstream outlet supporting the side of the union and the rank and file on an issue. I knew it was going to help them. And so, everybody in that was the sort of story where a lot of people in that union and a lot of people in other jobs in that sector were going to read it because it was relevant to them. And in that sense, being able to sort of lay out what I did in the story was laying out the history of this specific contract fight, and how the type of contract that was being proposed by the company, really has undermined working class power. And so it's the sort of thing where I know that a lot of working class people are going to read it, and it's going to inform their own understanding of what contracts they may or may not be facing in the future. But it's a delicate balance, because you're, in certain ways, to me at least, in my writing, because I'm so kind of openly partisan about this stuff, is like, I do wonder about, okay, this is being read by the bosses, and there's something to be said about just how you frame the narrative so that it doesn't end up being, here's one more example of why the poor suck, or why we can't fix this. So I always kind of insert some, what do we do and how can we fix this into the story as well. That sort of pressures a read that might be uncomfortable for the richer readers.
And honestly, I think some of these conversations to have are a little bit uncomfortable. When you come from a room full of journalists, these conversations can be a little uncomfortable, but I think they're really important, and I think we definitely need to be having these. So I applaud you guys for answering these. And probably another one that might make a lot of some people uncomfortable, but you mentioned diversification. Clearly, a huge issue in journalism right now, and I think it's been a big mandate for a lot of newsrooms, right, to diversify, to make sure we bring in people from different, different genders, different races, different sexual orientations. But what we do often see is that, no matter sort of what this crowd may look like, they're often still coming from a sort of singular class of people, right? We kind of know what we're talking about, the J school educated person who can sort of afford to take, 2 or 3 unpaid internships in a row, move to a big urban center, and, really struggle for a while, but who sort of have the ability to do so and still, pay their bills and still be able to live. What do you think media organizations specifically can do to really access people from lower income communities into their newsrooms? And really, what do you think happens to the state of journalism when this doesn't happen?
Well, going back to the issue of financial sustainability, I think we do need a sustainable revenue model, but I also think that making sure that our newsrooms are diverse in the most, apart from being important from an ethical perspective, if we're not producing content that is relevant and reflects the experiences of now the majority of our city, who will buy it? It makes sense to have a newsroom that is representative. In terms of what organizations can do, again, in the newspaper industry, we obviously are facing some very, very real constraints, but I also think there's still room for decision making. I think that when you do have interns or a crop of new reporters, you can think about the fact that some may need extra support because they may not come with the privileges of someone who has been able to do 2 or 3 unpaid internships. I think, one of the problems I've seen in our newsroom is that folks come for, a 1-year internship or a few months internship, and it's sort of sink or swim, and that it's assuming there's an even playing field when there's not. And so I think that more thought needs to be put into how we can support journalists who get into our newsroom and have something to add and contribute, but may need our support.
So I guess the obvious answer to this is that unionizing helps. We're certainly seeing a really serious wave of unionizing happening in American media. And it's making a huge difference. It ends up being the vehicle that then people can look at everyone's salary and say, oh my God, there's just severe discrimination happening in this newsroom or at this publication, that they wouldn't have had that data otherwise, because everyone was operating in this kind of sink or swim individual kind of how do I get ahead model. So having a union, having like an empowered rank and file that shares with one another both their experiences but also information, so unions themselves can, I'm relatively new to the media world, and there's just so many things that, and I never knew a journalist, growing up or in college. That sort of thing was just not a world I was familiar with at all, and there's a lot of information that you don't have without that, at least in your social world. And so I think unions themselves can be really useful about, it sounds like you guys yourselves hold these seminars for freelancers and whatnot about how to pitch and things like that. But I think more intentional kind of sharing of that information, because the experience for me has been just that despite many journalists thinking this is a merit-based industry, this is about social networks. And so if that's going to be the case, then you're going to have really serious discrimination along every possible line of oppression. But to the first part of your question about diversification, there's the business-friendly version of that, which is a more diverse newsroom, but still from, J schools, still from rich kids, more or less. And so I think, I was hearing someone recently describe their own publication touting its diversity, but when you look at where people of color work, it was as all temps. And so that is as much a cover for exploitation. It's just a new version of it. So I think, to your question, whether it's going to be obviously paying your interns, finding interns that aren't necessarily on the track to be journalists but want to write and they have something to say. Now, if that means finding young people who are active in community organizations or in movements or whatever the issue may be, to me it's much more important to ensure that someone who has something to say then gets the help they need to start saying it, than it is to, recruit from sort of the highest credentialed people. So I think in my work as an editor, it means finding people who've never written a story but really have something to say and then helping them learn to write. I think it's a resource-intensive thing to do that, but it always ends up being completely worth it. Yeah.
With that said, I do want to, specify that, a major part of what CWA Canada does, and especially the CWA Canada Associate Members Program, which is the free, non-dues paying branch of the union, is trying to help those same young media workers get their footing when they sort of first break into the industry, and sort of having these collectives, having these groups with you, whether you are a freelancer or you are part of a media organization, when you don't really come from those well-connected backgrounds, having this collective to rely on, even just being able to come to a networking event like this and just meet the right people who you might not necessarily meet otherwise, can be a real big boon for you guys. So that said, I do want to shift gears slightly a little bit. And I should also preface this to say, guys, we have about 2 questions left on the panel. So if you guys have questions that you want to ask our panelists, I would start thinking about those now. So I would want to say that the unionization rate here in Canada is just under 30%, and roughly, I want to say 10% in the US. So this has sort of coincided with labor reporters and the labor beats themselves sort of disappearing from news coverage. Do you guys think that labor reporting is still relevant today, and why?
We're both going to say no. So I think labor reporting it's hard to say, is it more important than ever? It's just, we have more, we still have a huge majority of people who are working class and poor in the United States, so that hasn't disappeared. What has disappeared is an organized labor movement. And in that sense, there's some, I get it as a business decision by a lot of these companies. The joke in the United States is you can count the number of labor reporters on one hand, and every major publication, almost all of them, has cut their labor beat, and maybe they'll employ a freelancer more regularly to cover that, but there's no dedicated labor reporter. I think what that means is, you just miss the reality that's happening, and you miss it more than ever, because if there hadn't been labor reporters, but there was still a militant and active union movement, well, you'd still know, because the unions would still make these things visible. But the fights within workplaces just keep happening, and now no one even gets to know about them, which is just reproduces the whole cycle. So it's hard to make the business-based argument that people should be bringing on more labor reporters. But the funny example of all this is we had a bunch of teachers' strikes in this past spring in the United States, and all of a sudden every news outlet, because these strikes sort of had just massive public support, and there's a rising left in the US, so there was a lot of people who were saying this is really important and making that argument. And so you saw every publication scrambling to find someone that could report on this. And what's interesting as a side effect of the unionization within the media itself is it's actually regenerating labor reporting almost as a side effect, where all these journalists are now going through the process of unionizing, and they're realizing, oh, this is super important. And all of a sudden they want to read and cover labor, and they won't accept a sort of anti-labor common sense, which remains common sense certainly within American media. So that is the hopeful note of US labor reporting.
Yes, I think we do need labor reporters. Yeah, I'm always surprised that it's sort of even a question, because yes, union density is declining, but we're all workers, and whether it's unpaid labor or paid labor, non-union labor, we all have some kind of way that we work. And I do think that the sort of trick as a journalist, as it is with any beat, is to make it interesting and engaging. But I think that stories about work and labor are really relatable for people. And, stories about labor do very well at the Star. I mean, people want to read them. So I think that there should be appetite to cover these kinds of stories. And I think it's worth investing in someone who is on that beat, because you just accumulate such a deeper knowledge of what's important and the direction that the beat's going in. And yeah, I mean, I think it's super interesting. So.
And I just want to add to that as well, right? I mean, when you really have a deficiency of labor reporters and labor beats at most news places, the actual quality of that same coverage is often the first thing that suffers. We often have, stories, there was an IATSE strike here in Toronto. It's still going on, actually. And instead of context, what you have is, here's what happened today, here's a quote from the labor leader, here's a quote from the other side of the table, and there you go. It's like Alex mentioned earlier, you need to give people history. You need to give people the history of their last contract. What concessions were gave up the last time this happened, right? Without the actual proper context in these stories, the stories don't amount to much. So I will say to that end, it's not only how important it is, but the quality of it also does suffer. So
I just want to add on that. I mean, the fact that there are like 4 full-time labor reporters basically in the United States, and then there's some freelancers like myself. You just see a huge difference. There's basically one guy who gets paid enough at his publication to go to everywhere where something is happening, and if he didn't break the stories, and he breaks stories every week because he's the only person who has the resources to go interview people and be at the site, no one would know. There's no one who could replace that. And what I see every time I write, I'll go read everyone else who covered the story, and they just quote, the union president, whereas I've never quoted a union president because I don't care what their PR statement is. I'm interested in what the people at the workplace think. I mean, sometimes it's useful to quote them as well, but every time I'm the only one who talked to a rank and file worker, and it's so obvious that if you don't know that there's usually internal tension between the union leadership and the actual workers, then you wouldn't realize why it matters to pick your sources. And so, it's just, the quality is just horrible in American labor reporting. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to, I mean, you referenced earlier the story about the WSIB slashing its premium rates for employers. And, to kind of build on that example, I went to that press conference. I've been covering the WSIB for 3 years. I know the stats. I know the way that they've reduced their unfunded liability, which allowed them to, slash these premium rates. I asked a question at the press conference on that subject. Everyone else's questions had nothing to do with the announcement. There was one other story, and it was basically copy and paste from the news release. No one spoke to a worker. And that's exactly what gets lost when you don't have a labor reporter.
Okay, and I did say we're going to get a little uncomfortable. So this last question here, it's about objectivity in journalism, and it's something that's taught and reinforced almost dogmatically in journalism schools. However, sometimes in the pursuit for objectivity, we can lose sort of important analysis along the way that readers really need to be able to make sense of the actual reports and what's being reported on. So we see this again when we talk about income inequality, when we talk about that issue of 1% versus the 99%. What does that actually mean? And we don't really get to ask why. So as journalists, how do we report on these stories, remaining objective, but also being able to highlight the actual causation of these injustices? And really, should objectivity even be our primary objective, if I can ask?
I prefer to think about transparency, professionalism, and fairness. To me, those are my guiding principles. I think when you talk about objectivity, again, you're assuming an even playing field, and we don't live in a world where it's an even playing field. Yes, accuracy is of paramount importance. yes, you always listen to both sides, you always seek comment from both sides, you exercise your good judgment. But yeah, we live in a world where there are structural injustices, and we're not being objective if we ignore that and we don't challenge the status quo and we don't ask questions about the status quo. I mean, I think that to go back to the point about transparency, I think I'm very lucky to work at a newspaper that is transparent about the principles that underpin us. I mean, if you go to the Star website and you read the Atkinson principles, it says very clearly what our priorities are as a paper, what we're here to write about, what we're interested in as a paper, and that's nice. That's sort of a liberating feeling to know that like social justice is supposed to be at the core of what we do. But I do think it's important to be transparent about that so that readers can inform themselves and read your stuff in that context. But yeah, I prefer to think about professionalism and fairness as sort of the guiding principles to what I do as a reporter.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the term objectivity is just, it obscures so much that it is fairly useless. Even if you want to argue against it, it just sounds really bad to say, oh, journalists shouldn't be objective, and it creates just whole new problems for you. That said, the way I think of it is, for a lot of journalists, I mean, especially if you're going to focus on poor and working class people, that in itself is a choice that you're going to make based out of your concerns with power and social justice and all of the rest. And so I think one way you can deal with this is say, well, I'm going to write about an issue that I'm driven by what I care about, and that's why I'm picking this issue rather than something else. I think that is sort of in the U.S. context where it's sort of, you have to make the case for why a labor story is news, whereas you don't have to do that if you're reporting on Donald Trump or any rich person and what they're up to that week. That's just understood as news. So I think a lot of people do this in the pitching process or in the beat reporting itself, as far as choosing stories, since there's just not enough time to write about everything. And I think, to your point, I think fairness is a good way to think of it. I mean, to me, it's just, I so instinctively recoil at the idea that they're both sides with equal weight when it comes to oppressor and oppressed, or the rich and the poor. And so I think you have to, for me at least, the reason I'm writing is usually to counter that power imbalance. So of course I'm going to sort of trust the people who are suffering more or fighting back, and emphasize their perspective, and then you'll include the denial by the boss or something. And that's usually always going to sound just very similar. But yeah, I think as things get so much worse in the United States, to see journalists still clinging to this idea of like, we got to treat both sides, fascism and everyone else, and I'm just like, how do you make sense of what you're doing, So yeah, I think coming up with, other guiding principles around why you're writing in the first place is a much more useful kind of orienting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, no, both very thoughtful answers to a pretty difficult question, really. And, I'm going to squeeze one last question in before we do open it up to the room. I just wanted to ask if there were sort of must-follow journalists or publications that you guys have in regards to talking about work and poverty today.
Yeah, so in the U.S. context, by far the best publication is Labor Notes, which is it's born out of a reform current in the American labor movement, so it's this rank and file focused. It's part journalism, but mostly, what they're running is the rank and file workers themselves involved in these fights, reflecting in a labor-friendly publication on what they're doing and what they're learning or what they're experiencing. And it's just because Labor Notes is open about being of the labor movement rather than an objective kind of removed source, they just are more well-sourced than any other publication by far. And so they break almost every, they know about a story before anybody else does, so it's by far the best place to get that news.
Sara, would you have anything?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think in general, actually, there's this saying that if America sneezes, Canada catches a cold. So paying attention to what, the 4 labor reporters in the U.S. or the Huffington Post has a labor reporter, a few organizations still have a labor reporter, labor notes. Keeping tabs on what they're reporting on, if there's some sort of trend about how employers are, misclassifying employees, chances are if that started happening 2 years ago in the US, it's going to be happening here pretty soon too. So it's a good way to sort of identify future issues here in Canada.
Beautiful.
And since I referenced him earlier, I'll say Josh Edelson, which is a whole nother conversation. He works for Bloomberg. And there is a real funny conversation to be had about why a business press is the only one that gives a labor journalist the money. They want to know what the workers are doing before they find out the other way. But Josh is definitely sort of the person with the resources and breaks a lot of good labor stories.
Beautiful. So guys, we will open it up to the audience. If anyone has any questions, I would just ask them to step forward. We can give you the mic.
Hi, my name is Gerald Parker. I'm from the Institute of Canadian Justice, and we feed brown paper envelopes to folks like you. So my question is about newsroom augmentation. While the rank has been diminished and the files have been depleted as a result of that, what are your suggestions to folks like this in augmenting those deep dives, long stories that take you 3 years, perhaps some longer, to actually get to the real bottom, the nit and gritty of it, so that you can actually report on them and have folks involved that are maybe seen as advocates but are truly the issue experts? What's your advice to journalists in that regard?
I think if the question is how do you, as a freelancer, or maybe someone who's not, doesn't have a permanent job, how do you get into those deep dives? It's a tough one because I think you do often need institutional resources. But what I would say is that I think there's a growing appetite, certainly at the Star and other organizations, to partner with people who may have a niche expertise. I think, and which I also think is great advice to younger journalists. If you have an area of interest that you just really lights your fire, then run with it, because that's going to make you special and make you attractive to an organization. But yeah, I think there's a realization that in a world of shrinking resources, we can't do everything ourselves, and partnering with others can be a really powerful tool to tap into to networks that we might not have, to story ideas that might not be floating around our newsrooms. So yeah, I guess don't be shy, reach out to organizations that you want to get involved with and see what happens. The alternative is that if you have a real passion project, that you kind of take that on yourself and apply for grants. And, I think it's unfortunate. I wish we lived in a world where investing in important stories wasn't an individual pursuit that you have to do because you feel passionately about it. I think, journalists deserve the resources and the stability to be able to pursue good stories. So, that's something that those of us who are, I guess, in a position of privilege, whether it's, belonging to this organization or, an established newsroom, it's sort of incumbent on us to broaden the tent a little bit as well, and make sure that we can make journalism a good job for folks who are just starting in the profession.
Yeah, if that's the question, there's no real easy answer. I certainly when I read about labor, it's as a freelancer, and I can't write those stories, which is a real shame because I'm really well sourced and I know of stories that deserve to be told, and they're just not going to be told probably. I think the institutional answer, again, is, I mean, unionizing has already helped towards this end. I mean, just raising a minimum level of standard for reporters, especially for ones who cover stories that aren't seen as, because the biases of the newsrooms themselves are often not seen as the big money makers. They're not popular, and often that's how people paint labor journalism. So ensuring people actually have the protections to write the stories they want to write is a start. And then I would just tell people, as far as the issue of, you know, kind of advocates and sources, is read what the people and the institutions who are affected by the issue are putting out themselves. So whether that means a social justice, you know, organization or think tank, or it's reading the writing and the sort of movement publications of the communities that you're reporting on, will actually give you expertise and information that you can't get just reading if you're reading the mainstream outlets all the time and that's sort of your daily news intake. I would say, yeah, trust what might be seen as an activist source, as far as, yeah, you'll get new story ideas very quickly based on that information.
We have another question from the audience. Beautiful.
Hi. Oh. My name's Jack. I'm actually an intern at the Star. Yeah. I was just wondering what you think the most undercovered labor story is in Canada right now and in the U.S.
All of it? I mean, that's a joke answer, but really, you know, for example, this story I just wrote for the Washington Post was about the largest private sector union contract in the country. It covers 250,000 people in an industry that, you know, that union produces 5% of the American economy. And these were workers who still are threatening to go out on strike. Not a single person. I think actually the guy at Huffington Post was the only one who had actually written a substantive story on it. And I mean, that just speaks to the fate of whether this contract is good or bad, or the workers strike or don't, will have huge effects for people in unions and people who are just working class people, because if they accept a low contract, that's a signal to everyone that they can push standards down even more. And it was just remarkable to see that no publication was really aware of why this story mattered. Fortunately, the Washington Post took the pitch. But even then, it was a back and forth with the editor, who said the first response was, "This contract isn't newsy enough. Can you make this a broader thing? Can you make this about contracts of this type in general?" And I said, "Sure, but it's going to end up being news." And fortunately, the end result was it was a story. But yeah, I mean, that to me is insight into just how many labor stories are not being reported.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of it. I mean, I think that when I first started on this beat 4 years ago, there'd been a little bit of coverage of sort of precarious work, but not really any coverage on what was driving it and how institutionalized it had become. I think that's changed. I think that I think precarious work is now like a term that we all understand. It's sort of like in our bloodstream now. But I think there's a lot of subtleties and nuances that are still missed. I think a big one is, I referenced it a little bit earlier, but employee misclassification. So sort of the way that the gig economy is functioning and the way that employers are designating workers in order to exclude them from basic rights. I think that going forward is going to be a really important area of coverage. I mean, I've written quite a lot about the workers' compensation system, and I think like a lot of editors kind of yawn at that, but I would be very willing to bet that the same themes that I've been reporting about in Ontario are happening in every province in Canada. I know that it's been happening in the US for sure. So yeah, I think that's another area that, like, more broadly speaking in Canada, needs some attention probably.
We have another question from the audience.
Hello. One thing I noticed about private employers is that often have large PR apparatuses. They can be quite litigious, and usually they have access to a lot of data that you don't have. You can see the anecdotes, but you can't necessarily see the data they have access to. So how do you make sure that you don't let them control the story while also being fair to them?
Very good question. Yeah, that's. I mean, I think for every report that a sort of business-friendly organization releases, there's usually a very clever economist who has things to say about it and can help you parse the numbers and ask questions about the numbers. Another strategy that I've had success with personally is, a lot of times if there's any kind of government process where employer associations need to make submissions or sort of pitch their case to the Ministry of Labor, they will, submit their report for review. And if you file an FOI, you might be able to find out what internally was said about that report. So to give one example, when the Ministry of Labor was reviewing its employment laws, obviously the employer organizations mobilized to produce this report on the truth about precarious work and how the numbers had been overstated in the media and all of that. And the ministry got an economist to review the report and provide his thoughts on it. And he was he wasn't a left-wing kind of economist by any stretch, but he gave a very clear-eyed analysis of what the report was accurate about and what it was wrong about. Or what it was misstating. So you can, if you dig a little bit, you can sometimes find good resources that help pick apart those numbers.
Yeah, I was also going to say FOIA, finding government documents often can do, court records, things like that. Also, sometimes if it's a unionized workplace, the union has generated this data itself to its best, as best as it can. And people can provide you with that sort of, there's a quote you can get that gives a somewhat accurate, at the very least, counter. And then beyond that, I think what you're saying about economists, the labor-friendly think tanks or academics, people that might not know this story inside and out, but have heard this tale of whatever the conflict is a million times, will often just instantly have resources of what this looked like in the past and be able to sort of parse what is often obfuscating language and, be able to back it up with their own data on these issues. And so often in the sense of legitimacy, you can forward a legitimate expert who might say the exact opposite of what the employer is saying.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question, and I would ask if there was a woman in the audience who would like to ask a question. Beautiful.
You both talked about the importance of talking to employees especially, and I was wondering how you go about sourcing and building those relationships, especially when sometimes the flip side of it could be they could lose their job if they spoke to you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really difficult part of this job. And again, going back to our conversation about trust, I think that the number one priority has to be that person and their well-being. And that has meant sometimes that even, a worker has said, yeah, quote me, use my name. And I've said, you know what? you might want to, like, let's actually talk about whether this is the right road, and like these are the consequences, and just being really upfront and kind of gentle with that. But again, I think tapping into kind of grassroots networks that are really sort of embedded in their communities. There are always folks who are super courageous and speak up on principle. So if you have a good trusting relationship with those sort of networks, I think that can help. Yeah, I would say that's how I have had the most success in terms of speaking to workers. But I mean, I've also been lucky in the sense that once you start reporting on labor stories, you get workers who just email you or call you. And I think a lot of reporters have fallen into this habit of like not picking up their phone ever, and you should check your voicemail and see who's calling. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my experience has been, part of it is, just as an individual, I'm very open. I write opinion pieces taking very left-wing views on labor disputes, and those generate sources like nothing. No amount of intentional, trust building could, because they see someone as an ally who's on their side and takes them very seriously. So I think being open about where your sympathies might lie, if you're capable of that in your position wherever you might work, is, people appreciate seeing a reporter stick their neck out, and they get a sense that maybe you're worth talking to. Certainly in the US, when so many reporters are just anti-labor from start to finish, there's just a serious distrust to talk to journalists. And then, I think what you said of, I had to write a really long investigative story where some sources said they wanted to use their names at first, and I was very uncomfortable because I thought they would lose their jobs. So there's a sense of it's important to figure out over time whether people are aware of the consequences. But it was one of the first long investigative stories I'd written, and I remember saying that to a friend who worked in journalism, that I just was, I'm going to use a pseudonym for this person, even though they're very insistent. And they said, well, that seems very condescending, because what if they actually want their name because they feel this is important, and they're, maybe you're treating them like they don't realize what they're risking, and they sound like they know what they're risking. And so I think a corrective is what you're saying as well, of like, sometimes people actually want to be that brave, and so being willing to respect that as well is important.
Great, so thank you to the audience for those questions, and thank you so much to our panelists for being here tonight and answering these questions. Guys, if we can give them a round of applause, this was great. Alex Press from the Jacobin, Sara Mojtehedzadeh from the Toronto Star. Again, thank you guys so much for being here. Now we have more time for snacks, drinks, in about an hour or so to talk to people in the room. You'll notice there are some people wearing red name tags. Those are mentors who are here from various organizations like the CBC, Vice, Globe and Mail, Global News, and many more. And they are here to answer your questions if need be. And you guys can also come to the front table and talk to me and some of my colleagues from CMG and CWA Canada to find out how you guys can possibly get more involved. We are here to support you guys in forming a union and just to try and better the working conditions in your workplaces. We also have free memberships for students and interns, and also a freelance membership for those of you who are freelancers as well. And guys, thank you so much once again for all of you coming. We really appreciate it. Give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you.